Running Scared by Lynn Cook, Chapter 8. Upon her arrival at the New York office, introductions were made, and then it was head down and get to work. They had allocated her one of the smaller conference rooms, giving her the room she would need for countless files, stacks of information, and much-needed solitude. Almost immediately, she encountered her first hurdle. Although the company bore the name of Phillips, and the principles in which it operated were the same, their way of backing up information within their in-house system was completely different, making it virtually impossible for Greg to have the piggyback project that he had in mind. After requesting some time with Greg, she explained the situation. He listened intently, asking the occasional question, which she answered, and when she had finished, she sat back and awaited his instructions. He raised his eyebrows. "So, what do you propose we do about it?" It was certainly a straight enough question, but it completely surprised her. The thought that this man, of all men, would be asking her opinion was not what she had expected. "Well, Lee, this is your project, and one you've done before. You've been faced with an obstacle which you've obviously considered thoroughly, and based on your complete understanding of the situation, that tells me you must have some idea as to how we overcome it. Am I wrong?" Was this the part where he was forcing her to prove she had initiative, voice her opinion, just so he could shoot her down in flames, Lee wondered. What the hell, she had nothing to lose. "In my opinion, Greg, if the end goal is to run both offices in conjunction with each other, then I see no other option than for them to use the same system. That being said, purely based on the fact that not only has a substantial amount of work already gone into the UK system, along with the fact that the UK operation is so much larger, I would have to suggest that you change the entire New York back office." She felt none of the confidence that she hoped was in her voice. Greg half smiled. "Fine." "Fine?" Lee repeated, incredibly confused by that single word. "You have a solution, Lee. So let's go get it done." Lee shook her head. "It's not quite that simple, Greg." "What's so difficult about it?" "Well, for one thing, the systems they have here are not compatible with what we have in the UK because I checked. So it's not just a case of a simple download. It's nobody's fault. It's just the way it's always been done here since before Phillips took over. But to change it now would mean many hours of manual data entry, which in itself could take weeks." Greg raised his hands. "So what are we talking about here? A half-dozen terminals set up in your conference room and some temps at your disposal?" "Well, that would solve the initial data storage issue, but you also have to consider that nobody here knows how our system works. They would all have to be trained from scratch." "Are you proficient with the UK system?" "Of course, I know it inside and out." "So would it be a problem for you to train everybody here?" "Not in the slightest, but that coupled with the fact that I will only be able to work on data once it's been entered, which will slow me down considerably, would mean I would need to spend more time here." "Are you saying that to extend your time here would be a problem for you?" "Well, no." Greg raised his shoulders. "Then I don't see any issues. Go see Jonesy, tell her what you need, and she will arrange it all for you." Just like that, on her say-so, the entire New York operation was to be changed. It was really quite overwhelming. As promised, the super-efficient Jonesy arranged all that she needed in no time at all. Being PA to both Greg and the new head of the American branch, Dan McKenna, who was being groomed personally by Greg himself, she was used to being asked the impossible, so took it all in her stride. From that moment on, Lee felt like her feet did not touch the ground. Her temporary helpers were enthusiastic and worked hard, allowing Lee to get on with the real reason that she was there and work the data. Throughout the day, they would ask Lee lots of questions about England, and especially London, and then on the rare occasions that Greg would come in to see how things were going, they would swoon and giggle and want to know what it was like to work for someone so dreamy. On this subject, Lee would keep her opinions to herself. Julie emailed her constantly, wanting all the gossip, every time devastated when Lee would inform her that there wasn't any. She would often hear from Paul, telling her how much he missed her, and June would check in periodically to ensure she was getting on okay. The only thing she found a little upsetting were her weekly phone calls to Lucy, which did make her feel a little homesick, but apart from that, she couldn't have been happier. She supposed to most people it might seem odd to be quite happy while working a 16-hour day, 7 days a week, but with the number crunching she had to do, as well as the training sessions she was holding, there really was no other option. Quite often during her training sessions, Greg would sit himself at the back of the room and just watch her interact with everyone. Initially, she found it a little unsettling, but eventually she became almost immune to his scrutiny and found that it enabled her to be not quite so nervous when she spoke with him regarding work matters, and a sort of mutual understanding developed between them. It seemed to Lee they now spent far less time sparring with each other, and instead they just talked quite amicably. Perhaps she might even go so far as to say friendly. She was under no illusions that this so-called truce between them would hold when she crossed back over the Atlantic, but for now at least, it was comfortable. Before Lee knew it, she had little over a week left. It was Wednesday night, and she was booked on a flight home for the following Thursday. The others had long since gone home, and she glanced at her watch that told her it was nearly 9:30. The hours she'd been doing were definitely catching up with her, as her neck ached, her back ached, her head ached. In fact, Lee didn't think there was a part of her body that didn't ache. She would call it a night soon and go back to the hotel for a nice, long, hot bubble bath. Lee closed her eyes for a second and laid her cheek on the desk. How wonderful that bath will feel. Would she order room service? She didn't know if she had the energy to eat because she was so very tired. A lovely hot bath, then her wonderful soft bed, her head on those fabulous feather pillows, stretched out between cool, crisp, white sheets. Oh yes, pure bliss. Lee. Someone had their hand on her shoulder and was gently shaking her and whispering her name. Lee. Why was someone there in her bedroom disturbing her? Didn't they know how tired she was and she needed to sleep? If she ignored them, perhaps they would just go away. Lee, wake up. It's time to go home. Home, she thought, but surely she was home. She slowly opened her eyes to find out what all the fuss was about, and it took her a few seconds to register that what faced her was not her bedside clock, but her laptop, and the stranger beside her was Greg. She sat bolt upright and then cried out, putting a hand to the back of her neck, which had completely stiffened up. Careful. His voice seemed full of concern. Give yourself time to wake up. He went behind her, putting his hands on her shoulders and rubbing her neck with his thumbs. She must still be a little dazed, because she couldn't help the moan escaping her throat at how good what he was doing to her aching muscles felt. Way before she really wanted to, she felt she needed to put a stop to it. It was one thing to feel relaxed talking to him now, but it was quite another to have his hands on her. Okay, you can stop now. I'm awake. His hands stilled, but remained on her shoulders for an extra few seconds before he removed them and came and sat beside her. You shouldn't still be here at this time of night. You're going to make yourself ill. Lee saw genuine concern on his face, so decided to make light of it. No, you just totally busted me. I don't do any work when I'm here alone. I just spend all of my time sleeping. Greg half smiled. Am I supposed to believe that? She smiled back. I sincerely hope not. I can just see by the look on your face how awful I must look right now, and I don't want you to think that you broke me. Besides, I wasn't really sleeping, just resting my eyes. I see. So do you always snore when you rest your eyes? A look of horror passed over her face. I wasn't, was I? Greg laughed. No. Lee physically relaxed and half laughed herself. That was very mean. I couldn't resist, I'm sorry. It's after 10, What time did you get in here this morning? Lee waved a hand at him. Oh, who can remember that far back? I'm fine, Greg, honestly. She turned and started switching off her computer and collecting her things. I just don't want you killing yourself because you're concerned about getting everything done before you go back home. She smiled. I'm a lot tougher than I look, and all will be complete before I leave next week. Don't worry. Do I look worried? She turned to him and shrugged. I have no idea. I don't know you well enough to know how you look when you're worried. He tilted his head as he looked at her. No, perhaps you don't. Although I think you're beginning to get to know me a little better. I think your opinion of me is changing, slowly. Lee felt this was a fairly bold statement for Greg to make, as in all honesty, most of the time, she herself had no idea what her opinion of him was, so felt it was highly unlikely that he could tell what she thought when she couldn't. She squinted at him. How fortunate, Greg, that you possess such a keen insight into the human mind. He smiled as he got to his feet. One thing I do know, Lee, is that you and your team have worked hard here these past few weeks. Well, that's what you pay me the big bucks for. Even so, I think it would be nice if you took them all out for dinner tomorrow night, on the company, of course. She looked up at him with a smile. Oh, Greg, that would be a lovely gesture. Thank you, and I know they would all really appreciate it. And does the same go for you? What do you mean? Would you appreciate it? Well, yes, of course. As you say, they've all worked hard, and it never hurts to show your appreciation. That's exactly what I was thinking. So, he leant his hands on the desk beside her. You take your girls out tomorrow night, and then on Friday night, I will take you out. She knitted her brow. You don't have to do that, you know, because I'm only doing my job. I know I don't, but I want to. As you say, it never hurts to show your appreciation. And I want you to know how much I appreciate everything that you've done while you've been here. It was way beyond the call of duty in a lot of ways, and I won't forget it. She smiled. In that case, I'd be delighted. Thank you very much. Greg couldn't help the smile appearing on his face as he made his way back to his office, knowing that finally he had managed to maneuver her into the dinner date he had wanted to take her on for so long. Perhaps dinner with her wasn't the best idea in the world, as she was obviously already in some sort of relationship back home. But she was finally starting to relax around him, and he was running out of time. Plus, he reasoned, if Lee really liked this other guy, then it shouldn't matter how many times he took her out to dinner. And if she really didn't like him that much, then sorry, Paul Wheeler, it's every man for himself. Lee refused to feel anxious about her upcoming dinner with Greg, although when she walked back into her hotel on that Friday evening to be handed a note from him by the receptionist asking her to go to his suite at 8 o'clock, her nerves did momentarily get the better of her. She knew they stayed in the same hotel, Greg in one of the suites Philip had on permanent retainer, whereas her room was many floors below. But in all the weeks she had been there, they had never once bumped into each other. She lay in the bath and contemplated her evening ahead. What was she going to wear? What would they talk about? Where was he going to take her? Oh, this was ridiculous. She gave herself a mental shake. She was a businesswoman. He was a businessman. This was a business dinner, of which she had been on many and never thought twice about it. So there was no reason to fall apart now. She needed to stop thinking about this like it was some sort of first date, which of course it wasn't. It was simply Greg rewarding her for a job well done. Being totally honest with herself, she had to admit it was not Greg's intentions or behaviour she was actually concerned about. It was, in fact, her own. But she felt a little better after she gave herself a good talking to. As Greg opened his door, two things immediately struck Lee, although she couldn't say in which order. One was how incredibly handsome he looked, and two, they had practically mirrored each other's clothes. She had chosen to wear a black trouser suit with cream blouse, smart but stylish, and Greg stood in front of her in black trousers and a cream shirt open at the neck. The smile on his face told her that he had also spotted the same coincidence. You look very nice, he smiled as he stepped back for Lee to enter. They do say great minds think alike, she smiled back. Coming from you, I will take that as a compliment. Please do, she bowed her head. I really didn't know what to wear because you didn't tell me where we were going. No, I didn't, did I? Come in and take a seat, Lee. Will you join me in a glass of wine, or would you prefer something else? No, wine would be lovely. Red if you have it, please. Was it her imagination, or did he just evade her question? Not that she'd exactly asked a question, so maybe she just needed to stop being so paranoid. Greg's suite, from what Lee could see, was enormous, and everything you would expect from a hotel of this calibre. The entire L shape of the wall was all glass. A dining table sat at the end on a raised platform. Down to the side was a large desk, and next to that a baby grand piano. The centre of the room housed 2 large sofas, with a thick pile rug between them, and a real flame fire burning welcomely in front of it, music playing softly in the background. Lee sat down and Greg handed her a drink and sat on the sofa opposite. So, how did it go last night? He asked. It went very well, thank you, Greg. We had a lovely time, and I know the girls really appreciated it. Where did you go? An Italian restaurant not far from here, actually, and the food was fantastic. Is Italian a favourite of yours, then? I enjoy Italian as much as the next man, but I would have to say that my favourite, however, would be Chinese. But we took a vote, and Italian won. Greg raised his eyebrows. You should have pulled rank. She smiled. I prefer a more democratic approach. Greg returned her smile. God, she was gorgeous. He could tell she was nervous, but was desperate for him not to see it. So, talking of pulling rank, Mr. Phillips, where are you taking me this evening? I was coming to that, Miss Connor. She raised an eyebrow. Well, that sounds ominous. She took another mouthful of her nearly empty drink. He smiled. Not at all, I assure you. I knew you would be tired, and I have an early breakfast meeting, so neither of us would want a particularly late night, so I thought we would just eat here. How very thoughtful of you, she teased. You disapprove? Not in the slightest. I can certainly vouch for the room service, so it would be nice to see what the restaurant's like for a change. What time did you book a table for? He shook his head. I haven't booked a table. That's not quite what I meant. So what did you mean? She looked confused. He indicated the dining table. I meant here. What, here in your room? She now looked a little shocked. That was the general idea, yes. Why, is that a problem? No, Lee composed herself quickly. No, that's absolutely fine. It wasn't fine. It was far from fine. But what could she say without sounding like a scared little teenager? Well, that's settled then. He got up and refilled her glass. I do have 2 other confessions to make. She looked nervous again. Which are? Firstly, I have a call coming in this evening, which I'm afraid I'm going to have to take, and I have no idea when it will be, so let me apologise in advance for my rudeness. Secondly, I've taken the liberty of ordering for you. The relief on Lee's face made him want to laugh out loud as he handed her back her glass. She smiled. I think you can be forgiven for those little indiscretions. So what are we eating? Chinese. Really? That's what comes from having such a keen insight into the human mind, he goaded. She raised her glass in a mock toast. And here's to keen insight. Well, that, he half smiled, along with the fact that I heard you telling one of the girls yesterday that it was your favourite. She squinted at him. Did your mother never teach you that eavesdroppers never hear good of themselves? He shook his head. Eavesdropping and overhearing are not the same thing. I'd say it was a very fine line, she teased, but in this instance I'm incredibly pleased with your acute sense of hearing. She took another mouthful of her drink. I'm surprised the hotel does much in the way of Chinese food. It doesn't, really, so I'm having the restaurant down the road deliver it to the kitchen. She raised an eyebrow. Doesn't the hotel object to that? He smiled. I do it quite often. You see, Natalie, sometimes it doesn't pay to be so democratic. Sometimes you need a far more autocratic approach. And if you want something, then you take it. Lee smiled. I obviously have a lot to learn. Plenty of time, he returned her smile. Despite Lee's anxieties, the evening was, in fact, very enjoyable. Conversation flowed, as did the wine. Then a liveried waiter arrived and served their meal at the dining table, along with a freshly chilled bottle of champagne. It appeared to Lee that Greg must have practically ordered everything off the menu. She spoke of her impressions of New York and of the people there, and Greg compared them to his own. After dinner, the same waiter appeared, clearing the table, leaving behind the still half-full bottle of champagne, along with a bowl of chocolate-dipped strawberries. Lee let out a deep breath. Those look fabulous, but I'm not sure I could manage another bite. I'm so full. Well, just give it a while and see how you go, as they're all yours. I'm not really a sweet kind of person. She raised an eyebrow. Really? You don't say. He smiled. I guess I walked into that one. How about we take all of this to the coffee table and seat ourselves more comfortably, with perhaps a brandy to go with it? That sounds like a wonderful idea. Mind if I take a quick look at your view? Be my guest. Lee got up from the table, slid back the patio door and stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cold but refreshing, and she leant her elbows on the railing and looked down at the vision that was the Manhattan at night. Swirling in every direction was a river of different-coloured lights, in some ways as frantic as an ant colony. But at this height, away from the hustle and bustle, it seemed almost peaceful. Greg followed her out and leant on the railing beside her. She let out a deep breath. Sort of beautiful, don't you think? I think I would say sort of absolutely stunning. Lee turned her face to look at Greg, and he was staring straight at her. They both knew he was not referring to the view. Their eyes locked together, and neither of them spoke, just stared at each other's expressionless faces. The wind blew some hair in Lee's face, and Greg reached out and pushed it behind her ear, resting his hand on her cheek. You're shaking, he said quietly. It must be cold, she whispered. Is it? I hadn't noticed. Lee looked away to break the spell. Yes, it's definitely cold. She walked back in and sat herself back on the sofa, wanting desperately to change the mood that had just developed between them. Greg followed her and sat beside her. I've had a very pleasant time tonight, Greg, thank you. So it wasn't as bad as you thought then, spending the evening with me. She drew her eyebrows together. What made you think that I thought spending an evening with you would be bad? My keen insight into the human mind? She smirked. Then you are mistaken. I accepted your invitation gracefully, in the spirit by which it was intended, as a thank you from my boss, and I have to say, I feel totally spoiled. You deserve to be. You've worked hard. She took a mouthful of champagne. I didn't do it alone. They were a great team I had around me, and they worked just as hard. You should use them again if you can. Greg nodded. They seemed efficient. They were. She smiled, the wine and champagne having well and truly taken effect, making her feel a little mischievous. You do know they all had a bit of a crush on you, don't you? He raised his eyebrows. Really? Lee nodded. Oh, yes, and I quote, Oh my gosh, Lee, how do you work for such a man like that? He's so dreamy, she said in her best American accent. Greg laughed. Very good, Lee shrugged. After a while, it sort of rubs off on you. The accent or the sentiment? Lee chuckled. Are you trying to embarrass me, Mr. Phillips, or fish for compliments? How would I be doing if I said both, Miss Connor? Terribly, Lee laughed. Very little embarrasses me, and your ego needs no boosting from me. You may be surprised, you know. I'm actually a very insecure person, he teased. Lee smiled. Oh my gosh, Greg, you are so full of crap, she said again in an American accent. Greg laughed. Oh, shut up and eat your strawberries. She grinned. I suppose it would be a shame not to have just one taste. She put her glass down, picked up the plate, choosing the largest strawberry on it, and sank her teeth in. Immediately juice ran down her chin and sprayed not only her blouse, but left a long pink line down Greg's cream shirt as well. She dropped the whole thing back on the plate, throwing it on the table and grabbing some napkins. "Oh, Greg, I am so sorry." She turned towards him, putting one hand on his knee and the other holding the napkin, started dabbing at his chest. He half laughed. "Don't worry about it. It's fine." She screwed her face up, still dabbing at his chest. "It's not fine. That's going to stain. I am so sorry." "Lee," he sat up straight and covered both of her hands with his own. "I said it's fine." He looked down at her face. "You have juice all over your chin. And you know what? You're right. It would be a shame not to have just one taste." He lowered his head and very slowly ran his tongue up her chin and along her bottom lip. She pulled back slightly to look up at him, her heart racing. "What are you doing, Greg?" she whispered. He released her hands and cupped her face. "Unless you stop me, I'm doing what I've wanted to do since the moment I first saw you, which is finally kiss you." She took in an unsteady breath and refused to think of all the reasons that made this such a bad idea. "I'm not going to stop you." He slowly brushed his lips across hers, seeming to savour every touch. His fingers pushed deeper into her hair, and finally his mouth pressed down hard on hers, parting her lips with his tongue, angling his head to give himself as much access to her open mouth as possible. She participated fully, pushing both her hands up his chest to grab his neck, holding him to her while her tongue was tasting and caressing his as much as his was hers. His arms fell around her and pulled her onto his lap, edging them both forward until he had her laid on the rug in front of the fire with him on top of her. He wrenched his lips from hers and looked down at her, his breathing unsteady and his eyes glazed. "I lied. I want so much more than just one taste." "Then take it," she gasped, and pulled his mouth back to hers. The fire that Lee had so longed to experience in both her loins and her stomach was threatening to incinerate her entire body. She wanted every part of this man, touching every part of her. Greg needed no more encouragement. He shifted his body to one side of her, allowing one of his hands to run down her throat, over her chest, to cup her breast. He gently kneaded it through the silk, delighting in the moans escaping her throat, making him feel instantly harder. It felt good to touch her like this, but he wanted so much more. He lowered his hand further, pulling out the bottom of her blouse from the waistband of her trousers, enabling his hand to go inside and touch the bare skin of her ribs, back up to the now lace-coloured breast. He circled her nipple with his thumb, feeling it respond to his touch, feeling her chest heaving so heavily where she was struggling to breathe, but still managed appreciative moans in her throat, telling him she wanted this as much as he did, which only empowered him further. He tore his lips from hers again and attached them to her throat, just below her ear. "You take my breath away, Natalie Connor. I knew it would be like this between us if I ever got to touch you," he mumbled against her skin. "I want to possess every inch of you. I'm yours, just don't stop touching me." She rolled her head to the side to give him greater access. He pulled his hand out from under her blouse and moved to the top button. As it slipped from her shoulder, he ran his lips across her collarbone, feeling her physically shaking all over. She hooked one foot behind his leg, running her instep up his calf, and her hands clawed at the bottom of his shirt, freeing it from its confines. She tried to move around to the buttons, but he was holding her too tightly. "Greg," she breathed, pushing at his shoulders. "I want to feel you against me, really feel you." He pulled away from her and sat back on his heels. He gave half a grin. "It's ruined anyway." He ripped his shirt open, sending buttons flying in all directions. Lee reached up and ran her fingers through the hair on his chest. He closed his eyes and covered her hands. "Your turn, Natalie. I want to feel you too." She looked up at him seductively. "Well, mine may be ruined as well, but I do need to get back to my room without being arrested, so I'll opt for the old-fashioned way." She slowly undid the rest of the buttons, her eyes never leaving his, and then he leant down and ran his hands up the front of her, pushing her blouse apart and laying his bare chest back on top of her almost bare chest. "You won't be going